Hello there. The final section today is about accountancy and IR35, something that's going to affect us all very soon. Handing to Chris.
Hi everybody, thanks very much. So, I am here to talk about this. It will probably be the most valuable session it can be if you ask questions as we go along. Quite happy with that. If you are thinking to yourself early on, what on earth is he talking about, or what does that work, what does he mean by that, probably you won't be the only person in the room thinking that, so do ask, because you're probably helping a load of other people out as well. At the end there'll be time for questions as well. We are planning on potentially talking about some mainstream accountancy issues on top of this, but we'll see how long the session goes on for. When do you ideally want us to be winding up, Tim?
We've been told to vacate, you said
by 6 o'clock, so we really need to start leaving by 1:45.
Okay.
But obviously, if for any reason this is going to be so popular, and then we can carry on, and then I can still send all the mainstream accountancy question and answer to everybody, because we've got your email address, and
sure.
And then we can still give you all the information.
And we've got all bring it on camera too. So.
And obviously, you're welcome to approach us anytime, or even afterwards for a drink and discuss your problems.
Okay.
Will you be paid?
Huh?
Will you be paid?
Paid by beer, yes.
Yeah, problems or perhaps opportunities. Let's be positive. Okay, so today we haven't, in reality, even though we've got maybe 50 minutes to go through this, it's not very much time to go through this issue. It's very, very complicated, but we'll go on a whistle-stop tour and we'll do some questions at the end and afterwards, as Johnny says. So, what I'm going to talk about is briefly introduce myself and JSA and KMB, which is written on everybody's name tags today. We'll talk about what IR35 really is and what OFF-Payroll, the changes that are coming in April 2020, really are. And of course, at the root of both of them is employment status. And the employment status tests are not changing. It's just the way they are applied to your situations is changing hugely. So we'll go through in a little bit of detail exactly what they are. It's very important you understand what those are, because if there is a way for you to continue to work in the way you'd like to, that solution will start with the employment status test. So you've really got to understand what it is and what it isn't, because lots of people don't really know what it is. Then also during the slides we'll mention what we saw in the public sector, because of course that can inform what we expect to see in the private sector, because these rules have of course been in the public sector since April 2017. And then, in very short summary of some of the options you've got for April 2020 onwards. Okay? And how we can help with that. JSA itself, so KMB, which Johnny runs the office over here, is a part of the JSA group. We are an accountants, like KMB, and we also have an umbrella business. And we've existed for a very, very long time. As we might cover when we talk about the public sector experience with the off-payroll rules, the rules came into the public sector in April 2017. In the 2 months before that, over 100 brand new umbrella companies were formed, who, funnily enough, were able to offer astonishingly high take-home pay rates for lots and lots of unfortunate NHS workers and other people who found themselves with a very small amount of time to work out how they can afford to live on the new way they were being engaged. And there's no doubt some of those umbrella companies will not have been compliant. They'll have been doing things like offshore schemes, loan schemes, and so on. So one of the things we're very proud of is that we've been around for a very long time. And then if you do find yourself having to use an umbrella company, either occasionally or on a long-term basis, depending on how you work, you do want to go with one that's been around for a long time, not something that's just appeared and apparently has no company's house history or any footprint anywhere. We are also fully accredited members of the FCSA. The FCSA you may not have heard of. Obviously it's nothing to do with the FCA or the FSA. It's the Freelancer and Contractor Services Association. It's a trade body that has come up with a code of conduct for how an umbrella company should behave. So it includes things like being transparent with workers, explaining how they could get paid umbrella via the umbrella, and how that will look different to them working through a limited company. So it ensures that they're treated fairly, they get examples of both, and so on. And we're fully accredited members. What I mean is there's only one kind of membership now. You have to be fully accredited, and that means you've been tested every year by a third party, someone like EY or a law firm, to check that you're complying with all the things in this code.
What does JSA stand for?
I don't actually know. I think it might have been the name of the original owner of the business with accountants at the end of it. John Stevens, there you go. I knew I had an idea. Apparently, yeah. Funnily enough, we still get a call, I think it's every day, from people who think we are job seekers allowance. But we're not. Although we are involved in the recruitment sector. Anyway, yeah, so long-standing fully accredited member, and I have to say that's because I'm the chairman of the FCSA at the moment. JSA Group is the third biggest doing the kind of things it does in the UK, so we are big enough to know what we're doing. We have got big for various reasons, not least of course because we do our job very well, but also because we've acquired several businesses over the last few years, and because of that we've ended up very good at migrating lots of people from one business model to another. And obviously as we approach April 2020, in some sectors there's going to be people who have to work in a different way, not everywhere, and obviously what I'm going to talk about today is the truth about, you know, whether or not you might or might not have to do that, because it's never a simple answer. There's no quick fixes with this stuff. But what we are good at is moving, where people do need to move from one to another, we're very used to explaining the implications of that to them, just because we've had to get good at it. Right, me. Why am I talking about this? I'm the head of accounting services, I'm the head accountant in the accounting services group at JSA. I trained as a chartered accountant and I was an auditor for a while. And the only reason I mention that is because that meant I had to do a lot of examination of legal documents, which often leans towards tax, which is why now I've ended up as a bit of an expert in this employment status tax law. I do talk about this an awful lot. I don't know what I'm going to do when this issue is all sorted, but it looks like it's going to take years to sort out, so I'll be busy for a while, yeah? And I work with HMRC, the Treasury, Office of Tax Simplification, Employment Agency, Standards Inspectorate, on how they deal with the public to try and get the message across. Because a big issue with this law and lots of other laws like it is that the public and business don't really understand what the law is. They don't really know how to apply it. So trying to get the message across is something I do spend a lot of time doing. And then I've joined the board of the SCSA in 2017, and I was elected chairman the year after that. So that's why I do what I do. So, what is IR35 right now? Because of course IR35, a lot of people are talking about IR35 coming in next year. Obviously IR35 has been around for a long time. It's called IR35 because it was issued by the Inland Revenue, as they were at the time, and it was their notice or press release number 35. That's the only reason it is IR35. So that's a little pub quiz point for you there. Next time you're at a tax pubs quiz, you'll be able to answer that question. It was obviously, you know what it's for. The idea was the revenue were worried that people who were employees would set up a limited company and work through that instead, purely for tax purposes, to avoid paying the normal employment taxes that were due if they were working in that way. We should remember very briefly, I haven't got detail about it in these slides, but 20 years ago when IR35 came in, the rate of corporation tax had become very low, and I think at the first £10,000 some of you paid no corporation tax, and dividend tax was, although there was a dividend tax, it was a notional, magical dividend tax that didn't really exist, which meant that throughout the basic rate band you were effectively not paying tax on dividends at all either. So many contractors felt like they paid little or no tax at all. It's not the same situation now. Everyone pays tax on dividends if they're using dividends to get paid, because you've only got a tiny bit that's free. Corporation tax, there's no zero rate band anymore. And yeah, you know, so that the contrast to when this law was brought in, I think, is quite significant. Also, of course, contractors have suffered from the withdrawal of the flat rate VAT scheme and other things that, yeah, contracting is not the gravy train it once was from a taxation point of view. Still worth doing, though, of course.
Didn't David Beckham try to create his own limited company to avoid tax?
He may have done. I don't know anything about. I mean, if people like footballers, there's all sorts of different ways that because they get paid for different things. Yeah. But I don't know. He's not a client of mine, and obviously if he was, I couldn't tell you anyway. Right. So yeah, of course, the idea of the law was to say, let's look at this situation where there's someone who may be pretending not to be an employee but actually is, and we'll assess that, and then we'll say what happens if we think he is an employee after all. People working outside IR35 obviously can take more money. It depends on your circumstances. It's not always a large amount of extra money, but it generally is better tax-wise to be working outside. And of course, IR35 as it is today in the private sector It's all down to the contractor to decide if they're inside or outside, and all the risk sits with them as well. If they get it wrong, it's their problem, it's no one else's problem. And this is a problem looking forward, because of course in the future the whole supply chain has to think about status, and today most of them don't, because they don't need to. Your end user doesn't need to care whether you're inside or outside today, because it's not their problem, it's the contractor's problem. So that's where we are today. So what are the new rules in simple terms? In the new world, if we look at a piece of work and say, is that piece of work inside or outside, it's the end user that has to make that decision instead of the contractor. Now there is a little wrinkle with this law, and I've nodded at a few of these wrinkles because, as I say, we haven't actually got that much time, but this is the case unless the end user is a small company. And that's for the purposes of the Companies Act, but it's not exactly the same law as the law for the Companies Act, but it's quite similar. Lots and lots of contractors work for very large end users, whether it's large tech firms, banks, whatever else. So almost all of those, there is no get-out clause. But this is important because what some people are looking at in terms of a response to these law changes is consultancy firms that are supplying the contractors instead of them going through a normal recruitment supply chain. And those consultancy firms may well themselves be small in some situations, which would then mean that the end user is no longer at risk, if that makes sense. So I can talk about that more later if anyone's got any specific questions, but of course in the sector that a lot of you work in, small consultancy firms supplying contractors is a very common thing. It's a genuine commercial arrangement. Under the new rules, so if you've got an end user and an agency and a contractor and their PSC, the end user has to make the decision and send that decision down the contractual chain. The initial financial risk, though, instead of now being with the contractor, is with whoever pays the PSC, the contractor's limited company. So the first place the revenue will go, if they think tax should be deducted and it hasn't been, is to what's known as the fee payer, which would typically be an agency or other intermediary. So they are now liable. And so, of course, in contrast to the old rules, agencies and end clients didn't have a problem before, but they do now.
Sorry, can I just clarify that point? I don't want to labour it. If you've got a direct contract with a big organisation, the tax risk sits with the big organisation.
Yes, because they are the fee payer as well as the end client.
Right, and if you're going through an intermediary agency, so you've got a back-to-back contract with the agency, and the agency have got a contract with the end user, the agency are now liable.
Liable, they're the first place the revenue would go, and the decision has to be made at the top and passed down the chain.
Quick question about the top. When is it the end client versus, say, Deloitte? It's always been a bit of a grey area where was it labour supply chain?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about there is the idea. In some cases, you would say that actually the traditional end client maybe isn't the end client because there's an outsourced supply of services. This is a grey area, and the problem with this is new law. So there is a carve out for this where you would say, for example, say you had a bank and they had some services being provided by IT specialists. If it's accepted that those services are a package of services being supplied together to that bank, then it may well be that for the purposes of this law, the bank is no longer the end user. The end user is the consultancy firm. But there isn't any case law to lean on. So it is being looked at by a large range of people, because this could be a very good way of potentially insulating the traditional end client from the risk, but it's all uncharted territory. Sorry,
This might be in some of your future slides, but you talked about financial risk. Do you have any examples where you quantify that financial risk, where perhaps there's an example of someone who was in the public sector that was deemed inside of IR35 and then effectively HMRC went and kind of took the payments that they felt they...
I can't point to it, but I can explain what it is. I can't give you an example, but so if someone... Sorry, I can't give you a real life example that has happened. But the risk is, so say someone is on, I don't know, £1,000 a day. The risk, the financial risk on that is PAYE on that £1,000 and employees' national insurance and employers' national insurance on top of that £1,000. That's the way the law is written. So you can see very quickly, if you've not deducted tax when you should have done, it's effectively payroll taxes. It very quickly runs up into a large volume of
And then
tax liability.
will that be based on, if say if there's someone being in a 3-month contract and they've just finished their contract, it will go back across all those 3 months?
Yeah, well, yes, probably, because it's on each assignment. You make an assessment of status on each assignment.
Yeah.
And there are questions. We won't have time to cover all of them while I'm stood up, but there are questions about as well. If the assignment you're currently on is inside, someone thinks, even if you don't agree, then what about previous work you did? Does it have any impact on that as well?
And then I think when you get up, it's like, so you talk about that £1,000 a day. So those extra payments, are they taken out of that £1,000, or are they taken? It's because if the risk goes to the end client, then is the end client due part of they need to take more money out of their kitty and effectively pay HMRC?
Well, whoever is, whether it's the fee payer or if the liability's gone up the chain, they have to find all that money out of their, just because they haven't deducted.
On top of what they would have paid the contractor.
Well, the employer's national insurance is on top.
Yeah.
And sorry, yes, if they've paid the contractor gross, then tough. They've got to pay again because they should have deducted the tax. No, the law's written very broadly, so basically the revenue can go anywhere and ask for, they could even potentially, again, it's no case law, but we can't see why the law doesn't allow them to go to more than one part of the chain at once and ask for the same money. Great law. Anyway, moving swiftly on. What did we see in the public sector? So many of you may have heard the Transport for London example, because it was a great example. What Transport for London did was very early, they assessed their contractors using, I think, the Revenue's guidance tool, which obviously has a checkered reputation, shall I say, no more than that, which found that almost everybody was inside. They told the contractors, duly as they should, they did the assessment, told the contractors, and obviously all the contractors were fine with that and just carried on working. No. So some contractors weren't fine with that and started walking out. So then they worked closely with their agency, with some of their key agency suppliers and some of their legal advisors, and came up with a more robust way of assessing status, re-ran status assessments, and then for those people who were genuinely outside, they were able to agree that. Everyone signed off on each kind of piece of opinion. The whole supply chain signed off on each assignment to say it's either outside or inside, so that everyone had buy-in. And then those people who could carry on working outside did so, and that was fine. But the point of that is, this all happened in only a very few weeks, because the public sector didn't really become aware of these changes until almost the last second. But people like TfL had to act fast because they were losing contractors. So they did. They went from we'll never use contractors again, sort of everyone's inside position, to a much more evolved position very, very fast. And we're seeing slower versions of that in the private sector already. What's interesting is that these things have started to happen before the rules have even come in. So you'll have probably all heard of some banks and so on starting to say, maybe we won't work with contractors anymore, or maybe we will. There's been different announcements made. Some of those banks are already having another think about it and starting to talk to people like me about what other options might be available. So I think that it will happen. The very important point on this, it will happen in many sectors in the end. I'm not saying it will happen by April, but it will happen over time. The reason for this is, imagine if you are a bank and you decide, right, I can't get the infrastructure in place I need to do assessments, I can't deal with this issue, I'm just going to stop working with contractors. And then the bank down the road doesn't do that. And it does proper assessments. And it doesn't say everyone's outside or anything, but where people are outside, it continues to engage with them on an outside basis. Well, where do we think all the contractors from the first bank are going to end up working? All the best ones. That's exactly what's going to happen. So in the end, large end users won't be able to just ignore this rule and blanket everybody forever, because in the end they'll lose their talent, or they'll end up paying a lot more for it, because if they want to engage those people permanently, they'll cost more, and they'll also be less flexible labour. So there will be a tidal shift towards perm, but then there'll be a correction some of the way back again.
Are Oracle contractors who have their own limited company, like many of us here, I've seen, are they considered self-employed or not?
For what purpose? Because you're talking about several bits of tax law.
IR35.
Everyone's different. I can't possibly answer that question from here anyway. I'd have to talk to each of you. You're not, because self-employment, generally speaking, in tax is an individual issue. But again, with this issue, lots of terms are bandied around all the time, like self-employed. Technically speaking, no one who works through a company is self-employed. They're employed by the company through either an actual or an implied contract as a director. But the way we all think about it, lots of us might describe them as self-employed because they walk around with their company and give their services wherever they want and they're their own master. That's what people think of as self-employed, but no, that's not technically self-employment.
I've always considered myself self-employed until discussing it with Johnny today.
Yeah. Well, I think what you meant by self-employed, you still are. It's just, no, technically, no, that's not what it means in tax. Because in tax, like every other specialism, we like to use lots of our own words in ways that other people don't understand because it makes us look clever even when we're not. Right. So yes, TfL, a very important example because I think you'll see a lot of similar behaviour in the private sector, but it will take time. And that's why people like me are going out talking to end users to try and get them there as quickly as possible. Because this is a genuine commercial risk to them. If they don't get up to speed with this, they'll lose their talent, albeit even temporarily. It'll be hugely disruptive. It's an unnecessary mess. It's also, just as an aside, I think it's a terrible piece of law. It's terrible timing. Why do this to business while we shambolically bounce our way through Brexit? Why do this to UK business? Why make it hard to hire contractors in London while we're trying to attract as much business as possible to this country? Don't understand.
I don't want to get into a political debate, but isn't there a chat that it actually physically hasn't got time to get through Parliament before April, and it still has to go through in order to become law in April?
It does, but I think there's also a risk that it'll go through in April anyway because no one's got time to revise it. The problem is that ministers and everyone else are a little bit distracted at the moment. One thing my genuine opinion is it would be very sensible just to hold this back. It would be sensible to have a proper review of it, and then I don't think it will be put in the way it is now. But you've got to get enough of Boris's or Sajid's attention to look at it and go, oh, hang on a minute, this doesn't seem right.
So it could just be rubber stamped through. You mean,
it could, yeah. We are, lots of us are making strong lobbying efforts to try and stop that happening. Because I do genuinely think this is the worst possible timing in the world. I don't claim IR35 works fine as it is. It doesn't. But this mess is not the way to sort it out, in my opinion. Anyway.
What are the government doing with their European law contractors?
Same as they do with everybody else.
So what else did we see in the public sector? Obviously in the public sector, people could move to the private sector. That won't really work this time. The public sector had almost no guidance, very short time frames, so it was a mess. A lot of organisations suffered, lots of vital workforce.
Quick one, I've just joined my scene's public sector.
Yeah.
I've just gone from my first one, I'm about to step into another contract with another government department. First one was direct with Home Office. They deemed me outside, so they went through this new CES tool and put me outside. Second one that's come up is with a large consultancy. So there's a couple of layers. They've got agency, the consultancy, and then you've got the government department.
Yeah.
They've already determined me out through up to the end client. They've already determined me outside. So technically, I'm safe in that line.
Well, because you're in the public sector. You're already complying with these rules, and your end user is saying you're outside. Well, that's fine. Happy days. That's what you.
Project role that it's not in-house skills
Yeah, whichever way they're deciding. Obviously, I don't think the CES tool is the best way of deciding. But if they're happy with your status, then yeah, you're okay. You carry on.
You're doing a financial system project.
Yeah.
Okay, so that could be a barometer of what could happen.
Yeah. So I think because at the beginning I was very worried about what's happening to the private sector because I've never delved into the public sector, but then I found, is it as bad as everyone's making it out to be? That this thing is it?
If you mean this law, is it as bad as it? The thing is as well, the public sector has now, it's had time to get used to it.
Yeah. I mean, to not divulge digression here, but recently there have been cases where contractors have challenged the decisions of IR35 status and they've won.
And some have lost.
When you look at BBC presenters,
they've lost.
So it's just whether is it we making them out of?
We're definitely not making a mountain out of a molehill, but yes, the point is like you're a great example of a success story in the public sector. You do think your work is outside, and your end users agreeing, and you're working that way. That's fine. The point about this is you've got to get your end users to agree, and at the moment, many of them won't even understand what the rules are.
Blanket.
Yeah, well, of course, blanketing is not legal.
Oh.
That's not following, that's not taking reasonable care, so you're not allowed to do that. You can have a policy of not working with PSCs, but you can't just say, we've looked at everyone and you're all inside, if you haven't looked at everyone individually and they're all inside.
So you mentioned the CES tool. Are they releasing a revised one before this all comes in?
They are releasing an updated one.
Right. Because a lot of
I still don't give it
mine
10 out of 10.
Saying that if I put it through the CES tool and I come out as inside, then I mean, if I come out as outside, I'm out. It's as easy as that.
Sorry, that's what your supply chain is saying.
That's what my particular organisation is talking about.
And a lot of people will start there because they'll be thinking, right, that's the revenues tool, great. If I'm using the revenues tool, I must be taking reasonable care. My point is that some people will evolve their approach over time because the CES tool, not everyone thinks it does a great job.
Is the CES tool kind of largely based on the old criteria?
Well, the criteria haven't really changed, and I have to say I'm going to have to zip forward because I'm not even going to get near what the criteria are if we don't. I'm really sorry. Is that all right? Let me go through this a bit quickly. So this is at the centre of IR35 and off-payroll. Off-payroll is just IR35, but the end user making the assessment, not the contractor. Okay. The IR35 question, the employment status question, is the same in both cases, and this has not changed. All it says is if we've got a supply chain like this, there'll be contracts here and contracts here, and there's an implied contract here normally and whatever, and money's going up and down and different slices have been taken off at different points. But ignore all that. What you're saying is ignore the legal form. Is the work here that Dave is doing for the end user, is he doing that work in the manner of an employee or in the manner of a separate business? That is the question. And we say if he is looking like an employee, then he is caught or inside. That's what we're really looking for here. So what do we look for in this contract? The problem with this law, all of this law, IR35 and off payroll and all employment status law, is it doesn't say in law what employed is. There isn't a list of things, and that is what employed is. So what we have to do is trawl through just over 50 years of case law and pull the common themes out of it. This case law starts with ready-mix concrete. You know, this is going back a long way. And also, let's not forget that most of this case law has been established before the internet was even something that people used on a regular basis. So the fact that this case law has trouble with things like Uber and online selling and whatever else is not a surprise, because the case law started long before the internet did. So what do we look for? The cases look for the three critical things called mutuality of obligation, control in how work is done, and substitution. These slides will end up getting circulated, so don't worry about writing anything down. I'm going to talk about all those in a little bit more detail. But you also look for other factors as well, whether the contractor is taking financial risk, whether they become part and parcel of the organisation that they're supplying, and so on. And we also ask this overall question, is the worker in business on their own account? We mentioned case law earlier. Someone talked about one of the celebrity cases. One of those cases, it was accepted that the presenter failed on most of these factors, but they were in business on their own account, so they were outside IR35. So the point of an IR35 assessment is you have to look at everything all at once. It's not just any single one factor.
Does the notice period, so if the notice period is different between the contractor and the client, so I have to give 6 months and they have to give me 1 month notice, is that now not mutual obligation? Is that what is that?
Let's look at the next slide.
Yeah, okay.
Mutuality of obligation, good question.
Yeah.
What this is very hard to describe, and I haven't got much time, but it's a kind of feeling of continued good faith between what could be the employer and the employee. So kind of, I'll continue to give you work and you'll continue to do the work. Often people look for things like notice periods, but you've got to remember, even in a business-to-business contract, you might well have a cancellation period or a notice period. So it's not that a notice period means you fail on this straight away. What's great is if you're genuinely in one of those contractual arrangements where you can say, I don't like this anymore, I'm not coming in next week, bye. But obviously in most real commercial situations it's very hard for an end user to agree to those kind of terms. That's why they don't really exist. So this is the idea, I'll continue to turn up for work, and it's very, very difficult to describe. There are whole books written on mutuality of obligation. One example I can give you, just a thought experiment, is an aeroplane factory which is staffed by a mixture of employees and contractors. And aeroplanes, if you build aeroplanes, you have to be able to trace where every single component comes from. So you have to have systems in place that track all that. If you imagine the aeroplane factory is working, it's building an aeroplane, and the systems all go down. So we can no longer track. The mutuality of obligation example is that in that example, a sensible aeroplane factory owner will send the contractors home and they won't get paid for the afternoon because there is no more work to be done. And the contractors won't mind because they know they get paid if there's work to be done. The employees will get paid for the afternoon, and a sensible aeroplane factory owner will give them all brooms and then go around and tidy everything up. But even if he sends them home, they'll get paid because they're employees, because mutuality of obligation. Okay? Sorry, I'm going to have to race through this a little bit. Control in how work is done. Every contract has an element of control in it, that's why you sign a contract. This is control in how we do the work. So, like I say, all contracts have deliverables, but this is different. Have we got milestones? So it says, we've agreed that you're going to do this by the end of your contract. That's fine. That's a normal contractual control. Or does it say you'll turn up at 9 o'clock and you'll do this for the first 3/4 of an hour, and then you'll do this, and then you do that, and then you go and check with someone else what you've got to do next. That's controlling how work is being done. That's completely different. And the example I always give, I'll have to get this wall built sometime. Say I wanted a builder to build a wall in my garden. I would give them a very, very long list of specifications. I would say I want this wall to be, this high, I want it to be this colour, I want it to do this job. I'd like it to be decorative or structural or whatever. I want it done by this date. And you can't work on it over this weekend because I'm having a party in my garden. I'd say all those things, but I will not say, and this is how you press each brick into the mortar. And I want you to start laying bricks at 9:15 in the morning, and so on. As long as he builds that wall by the due date to my specification, I'll be happy. He's not my employee. I am not controlling how he does the work. I'm controlling what he delivers, and that's fine. Okay? What's known as last of the 3 silver bullets is substitution. This is very important. This is an unfettered right to substitute. So in my supply chain example, Dave Limited, the PSC workers company, they must have the right to send someone else other than Dave. And Dave Limited will pay the substitute. Often I have contractors talk to me saying, oh, there's substitution all the time where I work. And what they mean is the agency substitutes them all the time for someone else. Well, that's what agencies exist for. That's not substitution for the purposes of this. It is all right to have some conditions around who can be substituted, because people often think, oh, I've got to have an absolutely pure right to substitute. I can send anyone at any time. No. For example, if you need security clearance to be on a certain site or a certain capability, it's all right for that to be a condition of substitution. It's not all right, though, to say, I want this security clearance, blah, 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 and then I want to interview this person for an hour, and then I'll decide whether or not they come on site if I'm the end user. That's not okay. So Dave Limited must have an unfettered right with potential reasonable conditions, but not unreasonable conditions, to substitute.
Is the PSC the same as a limited company?
Yeah, PSC is Personal Service Company, which is the limited company. The PSC and the limited company is Dave Limited. So yeah, the decision must rest with Dave Limited. And the other important point with this is it's a right. This does not have to have happened. There has to be a real contractual right, and the court will look to see if they believe there was a right. So many contracts have this right of substitution in. What court will normally do is look at the situation. They will look for evidence that has anyone ever substituted in this situation, but they will just say genuinely, can they imagine a situation where substitution was really possible?
If this isn't a great question, we can crack on, but say for instance today, I've got my client commitments, I've got a milestone say to deliver next week. I say to the client, I'm going to go to the conference today, I'll still get this stuff done, I'm not going to send, basically I'm not sending a substitute today because I don't need one. Is that kind of okay in terms of outside of...
So the question was, if I don't do the work say and don't send a substitute, right? So that's irrelevant for this, but I would say the description that you've just given about how you work sounds good about control in how you get the work done. Yeah. You just decided you're not working on that today because you want to go and do something else.
Yeah.
Because you're your own boss.
Or you got,
yeah. So gas safe is just an example of a reasonable condition might be I want a substitute to also have a gas safe certification. Perfectly reasonable condition. What does in business on your own account mean? It says, for example, does the contractor's PSC carry insurance? Because most real businesses do carry insurance. Does it have premises? Obviously, again, this is where employment laws not really move with the time. Most people nowadays do not have a premises on the high street because they don't need one. But that would be a great indication that someone was a business. Do you put defective work right at your own cost? My builder came in, that wall falls down the following week. Am I going to be happy to pay the builder again to build it again? No. Of course I'm not. He will have to come and put it right at his own cost because he's a business. And yeah, this is another good test. If someone went into the premises of the end user, could they tell the difference between those people who are contracting and those people who are employees? Because if they couldn't, it's a good chance that your working practices will have turned into those of an employee. So yeah, and I have seen this before. Contractors who end up being on the holiday planner or having the same appraisals as employees, this is not good stuff. It does happen though. So, to recap, we've got to get this very, very clear. If we are looking for someone to be outside IR35, what do we need? We need a lack of mutuality of obligation. So a lack of this continued good faith between the two parties. And it only has to be in one direction, of course, because it's mutuality of obligation. So we want a lack of that. We want very little control in how work is completed. That doesn't mean no control over what is done. It means very little control in how work is completed. We want an unfettered right to substitute. Obviously, if it genuinely happens regularly, that's wonderful evidence that there is a right, but we are only looking for a right. We want to see the contractor looking like they're in business in their own account, and this doesn't have to be having your own premises. It could be making sure that you're out securing your next contract. You're learning other things to develop the capability of your business. You know, you have a web presence with, you know, testimonials from previous people that have used you, that sort of stuff. And we don't need all of these things. Employment status is around, you know, you consider everything at once. And these three, what are known as these silver bullets, control, mutuality obligation and the substitution right, it's generally held, if you've got a very strong win on any of those, then that is enough to keep you outside. And yeah, as I mentioned before, there's that celebrity case where basically they lost on these three silver bullets, but they still won overall because they were still in business on their own account. Yeah.
Substitution, that has to be a couple of practice, doesn't it? Because I know that that's written into a lot of contracts.
Yeah.
Saying it's unfettered, but then if they go and ask the client, they go, oh no, why would we let anybody else come in?
That's exactly what the court would do. So they would say, yeah, I know it's in your contract, but do we think, and the court will hear from people in the supply chain and say, would you have allowed this? And very often the end user go, no, of course I wouldn't. But yeah, there's no point putting things in the contract that aren't reflected in real life. And a good status assessment that we or anyone else would do, we'll look at contracts, but we'll also ask the contractor what happens in daily life. This is another problem with this terrible legislation. IR35 you do at the end of the year when you've done the work. You decide whether you were employed or whether you look like an employee or not. This legislation, you have to decide before the contractor is engaged. So you don't genuinely know what your working practices are, or you might not. But the same test being used, yeah.
We've received 750 contractors have received an email from one of my clients at the moment, basically turning that on its head and trying to say that they have advice from HMRC that if any of the factors apply, then you're caught as an employee, which seems to try and turn the case laws on its head.
Yeah, that's wrong.
Yeah, and the other thing they're doing is assessing the rules, a mythical rule, rather than the actual real relationship.
That's not in line with the law either. No, that's blanketing. Arguably, the letters that went out to the GSK Glaxo contractors recently, because the letters seem to suggest that the revenue is saying that all 1,500 people are all caught, certainly on a role basis. They certainly haven't looked at the working practices of every single one of those 1,500 people, so it's hard to see how they can have been applying the rules correctly. Common myths, my favourite section here. Are all long engagements caught by IR35? Anyone know, is there a time limit that if you've gone longer than a time limit you're inside? No, of course not. What is true is that longer assignments become more dangerous, but they become more dangerous because people accidentally put themselves on the holiday planner, or they slightly amend the deliverable and no one bothers to do any paperwork, or they just start helping out with something else that they weren't originally contracted to do. The risk of those things happening gets bigger the longer an engagement is, but it's not the length of the engagement that's the problem. Okay? You could have someone who's working for one end user for 10 years on several discrete projects. They may be absolutely 100% outside IR35.
An example, so basically he works on a project for a year, and then he goes into BAU, business as usual support. Yeah, so that becomes
yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it needs, and this will be even more important in the future because again, the point here is that at the moment that's the contractor's problem. So there isn't much of an impact, much of a pressure applied to the agency or the end user to make sure they keep doing everything, following everything by the book every single time. But in the new world, there will be. What about, I've got more than one client, so I'm outside, aren't I? Is that true? No, absolutely not. What about people who are part-time employees? Maybe they work somewhere 2 days a week. Are they not employed because they don't work for that person for all week? No. You could easily have 5 different assignments, one on Monday, one on Tuesday. They could all be inside, or 2 of them could be outside and 3 of them could be inside. It is true, again, there's something behind the myth. If you do regularly jump between clients, it's more likely you'll be working in the way that a contractor would want to be working to look outside IR35, to be outside IR35. You're more likely to carefully agree milestones. You're not likely to accidentally start doing employee type things at an end user, because you know you're a career contractor. But just having more than one client, and especially if you hear people saying, oh, I work in one place for 2 years and then I go somewhere else for a week and then I go back, so I'm fine. No, definitely not. That is not keeping you safe. What about if my contract says I'm not an employee? Am I okay? No, of course not. Because your contract can say anything. It's what the working practices are that underlie what you're doing that matter. Literally, if that was all right, I would have a very easy job, wouldn't I? Because I could go around, I could solve everyone's problem. It'd be £100 each. I'll put this magic, little-known piece of legislation in your contract. No, it doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. It is good if your contract clearly indicates the intention of both parties, and most of your contracts, I'm sure, will say, no, we do not intend anything in this contract to create an employee-employment situation. But you can't just say, oh, it's all right, I've had my contract freshened up, I'm going to be fine now. It's the working practices that matter more than anything else. In court, court will look at your contract and your working practices, and if they disagree, they will go with your working practices. Okay? Because you can put anything in the contract. What about my agency can substitute me, so I'm fine? Everyone that's been listening carefully already knows the answer to this, because I've already said it. No, of course not. That's what agencies are for, to substitute people. Dave Limited has to be substituting, or it's not the right kind of substitution.
Can you go back to that third statement again?
Which one?
If the contract says the agency, if I've got a contract with the agency, and the agency, the third statement,
This?
No, as long as my contract says I'm not an employee, I'm fine. Why is that?
Because the status test is looking at how you are working for the eventual benefit of the end user, whether that's the real end user or the consultancy end user.
Yeah.
If that contract just says you're not an employee, the status test looks at how you operate, how you do that work. It doesn't look at the contracts and just say, oh, well, what does it say? Am I an employee? It's looking at how you work. Do you work like an employee, or do you work like a business-to-business operative? Like I say, it's not unhelpful, but it doesn't keep you safe. Oh, what was that last one? Yeah, and of course this one, is it my agency's problem if my status is incorrect? And of course the answer to that is, in the private sector, not today, but soon it will be, because they'll be the fee payer. And so if tax isn't deducted, and it should have been, it's then very much the agency's problem.
As well as ours, isn't it?
Well, again, no case law, it's not clear. So the kind of implicit in your question is, what about the agency doesn't deduct tax, and then you say, oh good, I'm even more certain I'm outside IR35 now, so I'm not going to treat myself as inside. I don't think you're any more at risk than you were before.
Yeah.
You would be if the end user said you were inside, supply chain didn't do its stuff right and paid you gross, and then you assumed you were outside as well. If you've seen that decision that says you're inside, I think you'd have to ask yourself, what am I doing with that?
But what about if the agency says, I'm not an employee, but I have, as a contractor, control, substitution, and the MOO option, doesn't that mean that?
Well, those things are important, yeah. But the statement that you're not an employee doesn't help you. Yeah. So, what are your options in the future? So, if you are able to carry on working outside, like this lucky gentleman here, then carry on as you are. Obviously, a good assessment should be part of the process. For you, it doesn't matter how good the assessment is in a way. If the end users manage to get themselves happy, great, you can carry on working outside. But what if that's not the case?
Chris, once the determination's been made,
yeah.
So you're in or out, does the risk then transfer to the end client? If they got the determination wrong, HMRC came after them, would they then have to suffer the penalties?
This again, there's liability transfer up and down the chain. It looks to us like the revenue can go wherever they want to. The examples they've given, they will always go to the fee payer first. But then the fee payer could show then that they're only doing what they're doing because they've received a decision down, then it would end up with the end user. Yeah. Well, I mean, most end users will be the biggest, most powerful. Well, no, liability transfer in this doesn't let them go to the contractor. But there's no reason, I can't see any reason why they wouldn't use something else to go after the contractor as well. Oh yeah, but yeah, that's because most contractors can't afford to defend themselves. Exactly, yeah. And that's why I don't know how many cases there'll actually be on this new law, because they'll be going after, you know, a bank or something, and I think they'll probably hire a lot of lawyers. These cases will either be very slow, or they could even be lost, and that would be a disaster for HMRC, because I think most of what they really want from this legislation is to scare probably people working at the lower rates in the market out of accidentally using a company and treating themselves outside, when really they're actually just temps who've ended up working through a PSC by mistake, or because someone's encouraged it at some point. They want those people to stop working like that. They accept that most people who are working through their PSC outside IR35 now are outside. They just think they get a very, very small fraction of people declaring themselves inside, and they want more than that.
Say I'm a contractor with my own limited company and I'm actually inside IR35. Can I avoid that by changing to another limited company?
Not just by changing, to avoid it. If you say to avoid it, you want to be outside.
Avoid may not be the right word, but
yeah, it depends what you mean. If you know, some people often close a company to try and package away any problems they've got with that company, but then again, the revenue, if they think that you're doing that series of those kind of transactions on purpose to avoid tax, then they've got other law they can use to open your situation back up again.
To avoid, which isn't as damn company, right? The tax avoidance and tax.
Oh, evasion's the bad one.
Yeah.
Evasion's the bad one. Avoidance really is just structuring your affairs. Some people think this is a trite example, but you know, having an ISA is tax avoidance. You're avoiding paying tax because you've put your money in the right place. Do you feel evil having an ISA? I don't think most people do. Evading tax is not declaring all your income or inventing expenses so that your tax bill's lower. That's different. I personally think the revenue and other people have allowed over the last 10, 15 years people to mix those two up, because it's actually very useful. If you can call avoiders, if you can call someone an avoider and they start to get the same kind of treatment as an evader, that's helpful, because then sensible tax structuring starts to sound like it's something nasty and evil, and it's not. People have always structured their tax affairs as well as they can, including in this. If you are outside IR35, you should not be embarrassed about the fact you use dividends to pay yourself, because you're allowed to. That's what the Companies Act is for. So what are your options? Sorry, very quickly. So yeah, you can carry on as you are today. Great, if everything's sorted and agreed. The next thing that we will see a lot of in the private sector is these consultancy arrangements, because they do exist now, not for tax reasons, but they do give an element of insulation for certain end users. Important point with consultancy arrangements: people can't just put all the workers they've got now into a consultancy arrangement and say, oh, it's fine, everyone's safe now. These have got to be genuine arrangements. So for example, you may find agencies at the moment who have large numbers of contractors in certain end users. It may be that they can start to more actively manage them and genuinely manage the service provision, and that will become a consultancy arrangement. What they can't do is just take a load of people on Friday, put them on new contracts, they all come in on Monday and do exactly the same thing, and now it's a consultancy arrangement. That's artificial. The revenue will be looking out for that. You could work inside IR35, inside OFF-Payroll. The mechanics of your fee payer paying you in this way are very, very difficult indeed. Most fee payers can't do it without manually intervening in every single payment and putting journals through their system. They won't want to do that. So most people, if you're going to be inside IR35, will choose a different option, either getting paid PAYE for whoever is their intermediary, just going onto the payroll as normal, or using an umbrella company, where again, the point with all these, as long as they're compliant, all the tax will be deducted at source, so there isn't any worry about future liabilities. And the supply chain then can get comfortable about that, because they know tax is being deducted on that work. Because the point is, the ideal result for most people will be, if they are working outside, to get the supply chain to agree and then carry on working outside.
What's the main difference between an umbrella company and a PSC?
And a PSC, or?
An umbrella company and a limited company.
Well, an umbrella company, an umbrella business is just any business that employs a large number of people for payrolling purposes. So an umbrella company's job is to take the costs of employing someone from someone else and bear them themselves. And so an umbrella, and this is important, so we'll talk about rates in a minute, I'll come back to that point. That's why the umbrella rates are often confusing. So you become an employee of the umbrella company. Our umbrella company employs thousands of people. They're on the payroll like me. They are genuine employees. And not all umbrella companies do that, of course. Some umbrella companies don't, and we'll hear about that in a minute. The agency or the end client, whoever would normally be paying, will pass a rate to the umbrella company that is intended to cover the costs of employing that person. So that will mean it's not just their gross pay, it's also their employer's national insurance on top of that, and obviously a margin, because we don't do it for free, and neither do they. If they were processing thousands of people's payroll in-house, they would have extra staff, they would have extra software that carry extra insurance, but we do that for them instead. So we will receive from the agency an amount from which we take our costs of doing the work, and the remainder will be gross pay, employers' national insurance, and anything else that needs to be deducted. And that will all be shown on the payslip of a good umbrella company. Sorry, not just the payslip, there's a pay statement which reconciles everything. They're technically not the same thing in law. So if you are ever given paperwork from an umbrella company and you can't tell what those amounts were, then they're not doing their job properly. An FCSA compliant umbrella company will lay all that out for you. And then the other thing you've got to look out for is that full tax and national insurance is being applied to what's called the gross pay. When you see dodgy umbrella companies, that's what will not be happening. So what can you watch out for to spot these? The umbrella rate must be made up of all employment costs. Often you might find someone in a situation where they were working through a PSC and the agency says, well, that's fine, you can just work for the same rate through an umbrella. You might go, all right, well, that's gross pay of X, Y, Z. You need to see how that's broken down, because if they're going to pay you the same rate, out of that rate now, employers' national insurance and our margin and everything else has to come before you get to your gross pay. So if you are faced with a situation where you've got to decide whether or not you accept an umbrella appointment or you accept the same work through umbrella, you need to know, well, what is the umbrella rate? Are you saying it's the same rate as the limited company rate, or is it a different rate? And if so, what is that? And people like Natalie at our place can help agencies and other people work out what that rate is. So you can press a button that says, I want my worker to receive the same net as they were before. What's that figure come out at? You will see some providers offering huge commercial incentives for taking on umbrella members of staff and loads of take-home pay. An umbrella company cannot give you loads and loads of take-home pay for any length of time, more than a week or something, without them doing something wrong. And it will be your problem if you're the worker, because you won't have paid enough tax, despite the fact someone else has run off with it all. Check if you are looking at an umbrella arrangement. Who is employing you? Is it who you think it is? Is it the person whose name's on the payslip, or is it some SARL based in Luxembourg or something? Where's your employment? It should all be in the UK. And is tax being calculated on all income? Yeah, so is tax being calculated on all pay? You may have heard obviously of loan schemes and things like that. All these things work the same way. What they'll do is they'll say you are being paid £1,000 a week, £200 of that will be put through payroll, which usually uses up your personal allowance, and you pay a few pennies in tax off the top. The other £800 is called something else, like a loan or a capital contribution or a marketing scheme system or whatever. In fact, and then there'll be a large provider fee that comes out of that as well. And you end up with your 85% take home or something like that. In fact, you've paid virtually no tax. And the revenue will come after you later saying, I know you received 50 grand that year, but you paid tax on 12. You've got a big tax bill. So I say this because it's worth repeating because it's so simple. They're literally, are you being taxed? Is all your income, all your taxable income being taxed through PAYE? And yeah, as ever, where is the provider? Because if you're employed in the UK by someone who's resident in the UK, then unless they are fiddling, then tax must be being paid in accordance with the tax law that affects all of you, which is what you want. Let's go back and summarise the new rules. So we mentioned earlier what will happen. They're planned for April 2020. There is more than the normal chance that these rules might not come in then, because the government is in a mess. There are good reasons for delaying this legislation, because it could be a lot better. But we have to assume you can only plan on the basis that it will come in until we hear different. So it's planned for April 2020, and it says every time someone is taken on, or their contract is extended, or anyone in the chain notices that circumstances have changed, then you're supposed to reassess. So you do an assessment, and the end user, provided, as I mentioned, they're not small, must issue what's known as a status determination statement, confirming the status of that assignment, and that goes to the next party in the chain, which normally be agency one, and to the contractor. And that's different to what's in the public sector. And if they don't do that, both of those things, well, all three of those things, reach proper assessment and communicate to the top of the chain and the bottom of the chain, they're liable for the tax.
What happens in April if you're in a contract, you're working for somebody, that company decides that you're inside as of April 1, okay, you go, let's say you can't argue the toss and you have to go inside, and you what happens with the 3 years that you've worked with them prior to that and said you're outside?
Very good question. So in terms of how this law applies to any payments made from the 6th of April onwards. So a payment made on the 6th or later, this has to have happened. As regards your earlier work, I go to something called the IR35 forum, which is as exciting as it sounds. We meet people who write the law at the Treasury and HMRC, and I asked them when these draft laws were released. Lots of contractors are worried about their historic status. If someone gives them an inside assessment and they don't agree with it, aren't they going to be worried about the previous years? And I said, can you guarantee you're not going to use that information to go back and attack people's previous status? And they thought for a moment, and then they said to me, we won't go back. And then they paused, and then they said, automatically. So unfortunately, I can't give you any comfort there at all. The fact is, though, being realistic, they haven't got thousands of people sat around who've got nothing to do at the moment, who are going to wait to try and spot when end users have changed the status of somebody halfway through a contract. I do think, though, that for that reason, many people may move contracts in March and April just so that they don't carry on working on the same assignment if they don't agree with the status that they're being suggested by their end user.
Can the end client or the agency issue a status, an SDS, within the contract?
I don't really see any reason why they couldn't issue an SDS at the same time as issuing, because it's all got to be done at the start. Once you've gone past April, when you place someone, you've got to know these things at the beginning to comply with the law, but also the contractor's going to need to know that in order to know whether or not they like the rate they're being offered, because they need to know whether it's an inside or outside rate or an umbrella rate or what it is. So, sorry, there's someone putting a hand up at the back that I keep missing. Small, it's Companies Act, it's broadly, you have to pass two of turnover less than 10.2 million. Often in the revenue guidance it says balance sheet of 5.1, but it's not balance sheet, it's gross assets, it's something different. And less than 50 employees. If you pass two of those, you're small. But in the Companies Act, if Tesco set up a subsidiary and kept that small, then then that would be small and would be exempt. But they realised that and changed the law for this and said, no, you can't just put a subsidiary underneath a massive group.
Could we start something like this and call it small, like safe,
If you were a separate consultancy
Yeah.
and you ran that business and you genuinely were offering an outsourced supply of services, if you kept yourself small, then you're back in old IR35 world. So it's the contractors then that have to do status.
Right.
Also, even if you weren't small, if you're doing a genuine outsourced supply of service, you're still insulating your end client from receiving liability transfer and having to do status determination statements, because you can do that now. You're the end user.
Did many people do that before, or is there?
It didn't happen much in the public sector, but that's because the public sector is the public sector. No, I think there's much more chance of that in the private sector.
Yeah.
Sorry, just one quick one, and I'll zip through the rest.
Is there any chance that you might end up paying too much NI? For example, if your big client is taking the full NI, employers and personal NI off you, and then you're paying your NI through your remaining money that you're getting from other.
There is, but with NI you can't really. It's not very easy to get it back. PAYE is self-correcting, but NI isn't. Anyway, I've got a zip. I've been basically done. How can we help? So this is what we're doing with people. The first point is to really understand what the changes are. Loads of people really don't understand what the changes are, or they understand a bit of it, or they think some of the myths. In order to get yourself through this, you're going to have to get the agreement, or otherwise, of your supply chain. So you've got to start talking to them soon, armed with the right information. We can do status assessments for people. If we don't work with you now, we can do something called an indicative one. So I can have a look and tell you what I think it would come out as. I can't give you a legal document, you're not my client, but we can tell you what we think is good and bad about an arrangement or a situation. If you are caught and you do have to close because of the kind of work you're doing, obviously you need to close your company in the right way. There are good ways and bad ways to close your company, perfectly legal ways, but you want to obviously plan to retain as much of that money as possible if you've got money in the company. And if you need to move over to an umbrella, yeah, we've done this thousands of times, so we can help with that. And make sure you are really aware of what's going on. But the point is, yeah, everyone's situation is unique, so you do need to take tailored advice from a good accountant like Jesse or KMB. And I think we better stop there, because otherwise it's just too much for everyone to bear.
Thank you so much.
That's all right.
Thank you so much. Is it possible to have those slides? And we'll also take more questions, because I'm sure there's lots of questions we want to ask in terms of, and we'll guide them to the team here. But also, if you've got companies who are not, are unsure what they're doing, maybe it's worth involving these guys to see what's going on. I know, for instance, we could talk to our company that we're working for in various ways, because some of them don't have a clue what's going on, and they're just doing. I know you're saying blanket is illegal, but I think some people are doing it. I think.
Yeah, there's no case law, so
yeah.
at the moment.
Sure. Okay.
Even if it's just panic response.
Yeah. So yeah, I have to wrap up today. Thank you all for coming. It's been a long day. We've got a lot of this on video now. We're going to distribute that when it's ready. Just to let you know that we're in the process of developing a mobile app which helps everyone to get notifications of jobs, of things happening. So it's a free to service thing where we're going to. A lot of the people don't have time in terms of checking the webs and stuff like that, but a notification, like a message saying something's happening, so you can just click it and just go to the information. So in the next couple of months, watch out for that. It will help us a lot. People can send messages through. Okay, so thanks again. I think we have to vacate very quickly because of different regulations. But yep. So thanks, and please be in touch with me.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks so much.
Hi.